In this video, I'd like to give you a little better understanding of the DBQ essay in general, and particularly the DBQ essay that you're going to be writing in the coming days. First, let me start by comparing the DBQ essay to the long essay that we've been working on for the last several weeks. I'm going to start by pointing out that there's not a ton of difference. They're both essays. They're both structured in very much the same way. The rubrics for each are looking for a well-developed thesis. They want to see evidence that supports that thesis. They want to see analysis. They want to know that you don't just know what happened in history, but you can explain how these things support the claim or the thesis that you're making. And of course, they both want to see contextualization and perhaps that complex understanding as well. So as far as structuring the DBQ essay, you're probably going to structure it much the same way you would a long essay, right? The big difference, though, of course, are the documents that the DBQ essay gives you and requires you to use. And here's how you want to think about this. In the long essay, you are required to come up with the evidence yourself. You have to use your knowledge of history to come up with several pieces of specific historical evidence that you believe support your claims. In the DBQ essay, most of the evidence is going to be from the documents. Now, I say most because it is not all, but most of it is from the documents. So in that regard, the DBQ essay is very helpful, right? But as we have been talking about throughout the year, it's not just giving you evidence. You're going to need to demonstrate kind of a mastery of those documents. You're going to need to source the documents, which means you're going to have to choose one of those four methods of sourcing. Remember that we've been using this acronym CAP, C-A-P-P, to remember the four different ways of sourcing. C means that you want to place a document in context. You want to kind of place it in its bigger historical context in which it was created. Audience, A, that's the idea that whoever is speaking or writing or whoever created this particular document had a particular audience in mind when they did so. One of the P's is point of view. That's recognizing that the author of the document was not an unbiased observer. They had views and feelings about whatever the subject of the essay was, and it's their point of view that is shaping what they're saying or doing in this document. And then finally, the last P is purpose. The author had a purpose in creating this document, and do you recognize what that was? We're going to talk more about sourcing the documents and using them in the essay in a separate video. This video is just intended to give you a big picture overview of the DBQ. You're looking on the screen at the prompt for this DBQ essay. And once again, I'm giving you a change over time essay because I believe we need more work with those. Let me pause here and kind of help you understand the continuity and change over time essay, or CCOT essay. They're giving you a time period. And if you recall in the recent LEQ that you wrote, it was a very big time period. I believe it stretched from 1660 to 1775, okay? This time period is much narrower, but nevertheless, over these time periods, there is evidence of things changing and maybe evidence of things not changing or not changing as much as we think. That's what we want to see in your essay. Do you recognize what's changing over time? And so therefore, it's very important to think chronologically, all right? So your essay should be written kind of developing the story as it played out over this period of time. So let's dive into this prompt a little bit, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that a little bit better. So the question reads, evaluate the extent of change, okay? How much change? Well, change in what? Change in ideas about American independence. So what they're asking you here is, what were Americans, colonists, what were their thoughts? What were their ideas about declaring independence from Great Britain? And how did those ideas change over this time period? So now the time period. What I recommend you do is look at the beginning of the time period and ask yourself, why are they using this date? Okay, now sometimes the date is a round number. Like we saw in the last essay, 1660 is a fairly round number. It may signal something, but that may not mean a specific event. But here we have 1763. Now that's a pretty specific number. So what's going on in 1763? Well, hopefully you're thinking, well, that's the end of the French and Indian War, right? And it is, and that's why that's the date. So now ask yourself, big picture now, big picture. What are Americans thinking about, independence, about their relationship to Great Britain? What are they thinking about that in 1763? And I hope you'd say, not much, right? In 1763, coming out of that war, were pretty loyal colonies of Great Britain. We had just worked largely side by side to defeat our common enemy, the French. As a result of that war, all of Canada, all of Louisiana, all of that is, well, technically not Louisiana because that was going to be given to Spain temporarily, but the Ohio Valley, all right, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the lands over the Appalachian Mountains that were so desirable and that sparked the war in the first place. Remember, Washington led a little contingent Virginian force up near Pittsburgh, and they got into a little tussle with the French, and that kind of started this war. Well, now all of that land is available to us. And so as British subjects, with British help, we won this war. And so in 1763, you'd be hard-pressed to find too much evidence that says Americans want to be independent, all right? This is a good time to be in the British Empire. But already there are some seeds of tension. And I'm not going to write this entire essay for you, so I'm not going to tell you what those are. But the point here is, think about the beginning of the time period. How would you basically, big picture, how would you answer the question at the beginning of the time period? All right. And I think we'd say there were very few ideas about American independence in 1763. All right. Now, methodically kind of work your way through the time period. And here's where having kind of a basic timeline in your mind could help. And think about, are there any turning points? Are there anything that really stand out? Any events or developments that kind of change those attitudes in big ways, or anything that causes them to revert back? And then let yourself go all the way to the end of the time period. So what are ideas about American independence looking like in 1783? Well, again, hopefully you know that year. This is the end of the American Revolution. Our demand for independence, when we declared it in 1776, is now fulfilled. The British have signed a treaty with us recognizing that independence, and we are now a newly independent country. All right? So how did those ideas evolve over this period of time? That's what you want to think about. That should be your thesis. Now, don't write your thesis just yet. Notice we have not talked about or looked at these documents yet. We need to do that, but we need to do that next, okay? I do think one of the major mistakes students make with a DBQ essay is they dive into the documents too soon. The documents are going to throw you for a little bit of a loop. Some of them are going to conform to the general thesis we just laid out. Some are going to challenge it, okay? And we'll address what do we do with that. But I think it's so important that before you look at the documents, you kind of develop your own thesis. You kind of think, all right, big picture, how would I answer this question? Because let's be honest, that prompt could be an LEQ prompt. You don't need documents to write this essay. So come up with that thesis, a working thesis first, then look at the documents. Now, we're not going to look at all the documents together here, but we will look at some. One thing you'll notice is that the documents often, I don't want to say always, but often are in chronological order. They're in the order they were created. Now, that is particularly helpful or important in a continuity and change essay. You do want to write this essay somewhat chronologically. You want to talk about the way things were in the early part of the period, how they're maybe changing, where they are at the end of the period. Okay? And the documents are in that order to kind of help you. But what I would now do is study each document, quickly get a sense of what it's trying to tell you, and then see how it fits into your working thesis. It's possible you'll need to change your thesis a little bit, or maybe some documents will give you your complex understanding. But either way, we will talk about how to work with challenging documents a little bit later. The first one here is a visual, and one of the 7 documents will be visual: a map, a chart, a graph, a political cartoon, a photograph, a painting, or in this case, a photo of a teapot, right? Now, the teapot is obviously referencing the Stamp Act. So right there, you're like, oh yeah, the Stamp Act, that's kind of a big deal in this time period. Now, if you really know your stuff, the Stamp Act was passed in 1765. The photograph on the left showing one side of the teapot says no Stamp Act. Oh yeah, there was opposition to that Stamp Act. People didn't like it. They protested. They boycotted. But the source information tells you that this teapot was made between 1766 and 1770. Okay, Stamp Act didn't last forever. It was eventually repealed. And on the other side, it says, America, liberty restored. So this teapot reflects the repeal of the Stamp Act. Now, how would that affect ideas about American independence? Okay, we know we're maybe thinking about how the Stamp Act itself would have affected those ideas, but what about the repeal? So there's a lot, all right, a lot that could be used in this. It also says that this teapot was made in England. So wait a second, someone in England is protesting the Stamp Act and talking about America's liberty being restored? Whoa, that could add a complex understanding or maybe some contextualization to our essay. All right, we're getting very into very complex stuff, but history is complex. But the document clearly gives you some ideas, some evidence, all right? How are we going to use that? How does that fit into our working thesis about those ideas? If the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, and we said that in 1763, Americans were feeling pretty good about Great Britain, not really thinking about independence, didn't take long for those ideas to change, maybe just a little bit. By the way, I think it's clever that the image here is of a teapot, okay? This is about the Stamp Act, not the Tea Act. But maybe you're starting to think about the Tea Act, and maybe that also can come into your essay. Or, didn't they throw a little party in Boston, something to do with tea? What does that tell us about ideas of American independence? So see all the clues that you're getting from these documents. All right. I would certainly, as you look at different documents, keep in the back of your mind, I'm trying to figure out what Americans were thinking about independence. What does this document tell me? And who's speaking? So in the last document, it's presumably an Englishman who's sympathetic to America. Now it's the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Colonial Assembly of Virginia. What are they saying about these issues? And now we're into 1769. All right, I'm not going to do every document with you, just kind of showing you how you work through. All right, now we fast forward to 1772, and Samuel Adams is speaking of the rights of the colonists. Well, even right there, the rights of the colonists tells us that, he's got a particular idea, and hopefully we know who Sam Adams is, and we recognize him as one of the Sons of Liberty. I think this document lends itself well to point of view, right? When we know well who the author is, and we know their biases, we know their perspectives, point of view might be a good way to source it. All right, now we're moving into a document from 1775. Okay, that's a pretty big year in this story. It's not from the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly, it's an address to them, and it's from Quaker leaders. So who are Quakers, and what do we know about Quakers, and what are they saying, and how does that complicate maybe our story? We fast forward and we have a journal, a woman's journal, and this is also in 1775. Very big year, right, in terms of the war breaking out and heading much, much closer to that Declaration of Independence. All right, we see that she is a Scot, so she's from Scotland, but she's visiting her brother, who's a merchant in Wilmington, North Carolina. So we have, again, an outsider's perspective on things. Okay. We move forward a little bit more. Document 6. Now we're into the year 1776. And we have an Anglican church minister in New York City who's speaking here. And he has a very unique kind of perspective on this revolution that he is referencing. So it's 1776, the war's already begun. This is the year we declare independence, although we don't know what month he is speaking here. But he's obviously talking about money and cost. So we're getting a lot of different perspectives. And certainly it's not going to be, the documents aren't going to make it that easy to write the essay. You're going to have to take all these into account. But again, don't lose sight of maybe your big picture thesis, what's generally happening, and then how do I work these documents in? And finally, our last document is in 1776. This is kind of odd. The time period goes to 83, but the documents only go to 76. So they're allowing you to kind of almost, I don't want to say end there in 1776, but they're kind of saying, if you want to bring up anything that happens during, the heart of the war itself, so be it, you can. That can be your outside evidence, but the documents don't go there. And again, we have a familiar document. Thomas Paine, we should know who he is, and maybe even be familiar with this pamphlet he wrote. This is at the very end of the year, 1776. And that ends it, right? 7 of them. All right, so again, just to reiterate, with a continuity and change over time essay or DBQ, you want to start by thinking about major developments within the time period. At least divide the time period into maybe 3 key stages. What's going on at the beginning? How would I talk about ideas of American independence at the beginning? Is there kind of a middle where things are changing, perhaps? And then kind of what does it look like at the end? And build your essay that way. Then use the documents to kind of fill in, right? Like I said, in another video, I will talk to you more about how to write the documents into your essay, how to use them, how to source them. But for now, I want you to be thinking about just the prompt itself, the time period, and what you're seeing happening in this time period. All right, so stay tuned for another video soon.